Hi, I'm Whitney Espick, the CEO of the MIT Alumni Association, and I hope you enjoy this digital production created for alumni and friends like you.
Hello, folks joining our Environmental Energy and Sustainability Network webinar. I'm Sarah Simon, class of 1972, civil engineer. This is our webinar on small-scale generators. Can they play a big role in a sustainable future? And many of us in the MIT alumni community have been watching the transition from fossil fuels, and we've been very concerned about whether our future generations are going to be burdened with global warming that comes from all the fuel being used today and has been used since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. I know that in Massachusetts, where I live, 20% of our power supply is now renewables. We started a portfolio standard 20 years ago. Many people hope to get to 50% of our power being renewable in 10 years, 2030. But critics worry about how we can get to 100% renewables. They argue the sun's not always shining and the wind's not always blowing. We know that in New England and many areas, 3 cloudy days are not uncommon. So we're very interested in renewable energy and energy storage, or batteries, often is the way we talk about it. And we want to know if we can get to 100% renewable energy or no carbon energy. So one of the things that has happened with MIT alumni is that still have one of the few nuclear engineering departments in the United States. And we still are working on things like fission and fusion, and whether or not that no carbon and how that non-carbon energy can play a role in the energy that our children and our grandchildren will be using. So there are many other technologies, and nuclear is definitely one of them. I suspect, and one of the things we'll hear about today is that baseload nuclear is not what we are talking about here. We're talking about smaller generating stations. The webinar today, you won't be able to use the chat function in Zoom. We do encourage you to ask questions and answers in the question and answer boxes. We will be monitoring that, and we will first have the presentation by Jim Walker about renewable energy and microgrids that will be using storage with solar and wind, mostly solar, I think. And then we will hear from Wendy Simon Pearson and Lorenzo Veneri about one of the new modular nuclear concepts and systems that are about to be launched. So with that, I want to introduce Jim Walker. And Jim has 40 years of energy industry experience doing analysis and development. He's worked all the way from engineering to strategy and business creation. I got to know Jim when he was founding and growing the company Amoresco's very profitable East Regional solar management business. He managed to get them on the roadsides and on on housing authority roofs and at the Department of Defense facilities. Along the way, Jim was recognized by the MIT Alumni Association for creating and co-founding the Ignite Clean Energy Business Plan competition. So he is one of our superstars. And Jim, if you would take it away and let us hear about how renewable energy is going to take over the world.
All right. Well, I'm going to, thank you very much, Sarah. And I'm only going to speak about microgrids. And as an introduction to our next speakers, and microgrids are a hot topic today. And let me share my screen and explain why. There we go. And let me move this. Excuse me. Okay, so I will be speaking about clean energy microgrids for reliability. And the first thing to keep in mind is that in the press, in publications, you'll see it everywhere. The primary concept to decarbonize, or the first concept to decarbonize, is to electrify everything. And so a big push is on vehicle transport, and of course, all the automakers are coming out with new electric vehicles, and then there's delivery vehicles. Here's a picture of Amazon's version of one. And so transportation is a big part of it. Heating is another big part of it. Heat pumps are growing in popularity, and even where I live in two places, and one place is in Maine, and Maine is offering special rebates for encouraging heat pumps and getting people off of oil heat. And finally, industrial processes. And the idea is the more that we electrify, the faster we can make the transition off of carbon. But that means that the electricity must be carbon free, and we're not quite there yet. Across the entire US, we're about 37% carbon free, 20% nuclear, and 17% renewables. And if you just look at, I just looked at the fuel mix yesterday at ISO New England, what was being used. And that's also about 37% was carbon free and across New England, and 63% was natural gas or fossil fuels. In Maine, 80% of it is renewable. So when I charge my electric car, I can fill at least 80% of it is from renewables. But that's the first problem. We need to get to more clean energy, and our next speakers are going to talk about one way to do that. The second big problem is that extreme weather is increasing, and it seems amazing that in just 1 to 2 weeks, we've had 3 major weather events that have cut out power to large parts of regional populations. Right now in the news is what's going on in California with the rolling blackouts due to the high heat and the fire-nados, as they're called, knocking out power and communities. And then we had the hurricane that came up the East Coast about a week ago, and that knocked out 1.4 million people in Connecticut, New York, and New Jersey from power for days. And then the Midwest had its internal hurricane, as it's sometimes referred to, that people are still without power in Iowa and other parts of the Midwest. These weather events are extreme, and they appear to be happening more and more frequently. And it's a major concern to communities and to businesses to be without this power. And the businesses are also concerned about other outages, and one of the areas that they're most concerned about is what they've been reading, and it's been in the Wall Street Journal and elsewhere, of cybersecurity interruptions. Could foreign governments come in, or could hackers break into our grid and cut off power? And the media and telecommunication industry is most concerned about that. 70%, almost 70% of business leaders are worried about a cyber attack on our electric grid, knocking out power. The reality is that there is quite a bit of power outages, and this is a 10-year graph. It shows the states with the highest number of consumers affected: Florida, California, New York, Michigan, and Texas. And you can see, tens of millions of customers over that period have been without power. And if you look at the table, you can see that California has the unfortunate leader in the total number of outages during that time period, over 4,000 outages. And the average outage, an average is is over 10 years is a misleading number, but 2.2 hours in California. And then next comes Texas, New York, Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania for the largest number of outages. So outages are real, it's affecting customers, and it's a real concern. And as we're having this extreme weather, it's getting more concerned. Again, one of the places I live is in Maine. Everyone on our street has a generator because CMP frequently knocks us out of power. So it's a common problem. So what's a solution? Well, a leading solution, and I'll talk about it more, is to install a microgrid. And community microgrids are gaining in popularity, as well as business microgrids. But the main concept is that rather than have all the power delivered centrally over a high voltage grid to customers, that the customers also have their own internal grid. It might be a community, might be a business area, might be a campus. And microgrids have been around for quite some time. Many college campuses have their own microgrids. Airports, many airports have their own microgrids. Hospital campuses have their own microgrids, but now they're gaining in popularity. And they're gaining in popularity because of the interconnection within the microgrid of adding solar and wind and batteries to that microgrid, especially if you imagine campuses that want to go green. Many campuses want to go green, and same with business campuses. So this allows them to control their own resources. And at a very simple level, a microgrid, which is controlled by sophisticated software, is the next step in the evolution from building energy management systems, which have been around for decades. But instead of just controlling the energy management or the demand and use of a facility or a campus, it's also controlling the local generation and matching that to the energy demand. The most difficult part of the microgrid is that interconnection with the utility. I'll talk about that shortly. But a microgrid, by definition, has a single point of interconnection with the utility. And the utility will need to do its own studies, which I'll talk about, to determine whether or not that microgrid, when it'll be on, when it'll be off, how it'll be islanded, whether or not, and how the controls will protect utility line workers that are on the grid side of that microgrid. And the interconnection is a sophisticated part of the microgrid controller. It's very important. An example, which goes from my Amoresco days, I didn't directly work on this project, is the Marine Corps Parris Island microgrid. And that was a project that was developed because the Marine Corps, Parris Island, of course, is an island, and the equipment used to heat the facilities, the laundries and other facilities, is steam powered. And it was very old and was at the end of its life. So the Marine Corps wanted to upgrade with renewable energy, storage, and a microgrid controller with the most advanced energy efficiency and technology available. So the concept was to produce the steam, there would still be gas-fired generation. Most efficiently, it would be provided by a gas turbine, CHP device, combined heat and power. And there would be backup diesel generators in case there was with black start capability and demand management in the case of a hurricane, because Parris Island is right on the coast and is hit by hurricanes. There would also be battery energy storage system, renewables, solar PV, 4 megawatt ground mount and 1.5 megawatt carport. And most importantly, which are the controllers. And the controllers allow the operators to efficiently determine what the best operating use is, to manage the demand, to manage when maybe laundry services are operating, so that renewables can be optimized, battery storage can be optimized, and they can learn from the operation and program the controls to increasingly reduce the cost of energy and to greater use renewables. The system was paid, it's a $91 million project, and it was paid from an energy savings performance contract, which is the preference for military projects, and Ameresco and other companies use energy savings performance contracts. And I believe that through the energy savings measures, such as putting in LED lights, putting in steam traps, insulating, these types of measures, that savings, which I think was about $7 million a year, was able to pay for all of these upgrades that were used at the system. And Hannon Armstrong decided that they would finance the project under a long-term contract with Ameresco, maintaining the project for 22 years. And that was very important to the Marine base, because the Marine base wanted an outside company to be responsible for maintaining it. They're concerned that such a sophisticated piece of system would not be properly maintained if left on its own. So it's a terrific project. It's fully operating, and it's a good example of a new microgrid system. Start with energy efficiency, use those savings to downsize how much renewable energy is required, and then integrate it all together with controls. The driver, a key driver, is California. And California is, I try to summarize what's going on in California in one slide. It's pretty hard to do because there's hundreds and hundreds of pages of rules, laws, testimony going on. But basically in 2018, the Senate passed the bill 1339 that promoted microgrids and promoted a process through the regulatory bodies, California Public Utility Commissions, to develop the regulations and rules with input from the industry, the utilities, and other interested parties, to create the tariffs that would reduce the barriers to implementation, primarily interconnection for one, and tariff barriers. So a tariff barrier is, under the existing rules, batteries can only be charged it can only be a certain size and only be charged from renewable energy. But if you're going to use a microgrid also for reliability, you want to be able to charge ahead of a expected event, so that the batteries are prepared for that event. So for example, if a storm is coming in and you're expecting that there could be fires from that storm, charge up those batteries ahead of the storm, even if they're not being charged from renewables, but make sure that the batteries are ready to go in the microgrids. So reliability is a key driver, and anyone who's following California knows that. And there's so much work and effort going into California that I believe that this will be a good model for the rest of the country. They're also starting a pilot, a community microgrid pilot, and that will be getting started this year. They've already completed the track one under the law, which was to start the rules and regulations so that they can be ready for the September fire season, and seeking to accelerate interconnection. And they're now working on track two, which is much more detailed tariff changes and with respect to storage interconnection rules. I've put in a URL for anyone who wants to dive deep into what's going on in California. It's, I think, a very important state to look at, and there's certainly getting input from, as I said, from all interested parties. But in addition to government and community interest in microgrids, business leaders are also taking a greater interest. So Deloitte Resources conducted surveys on a range of energy issues, and one of the surveys had to do with business leaders' interest in microgrids. and that they found that the interest is rising sharply, went up 9% from 2019 to 2020. And you can see that the reasons why business leaders are interested in microgrids, the top 3 reasons have to do with reliability and concern for reliability. And then after that is renewable energy. But,
Jim, could
yeah.
you make sure that you speak up and speak right into your microphone? I love talking with you. You have been dropping off a little at the end. Thank you.
Okay. And the 2020, though, has been a challenging year for microgrids. And it's being blamed on the virus. There's just been 129 installations in the first half of the year, and that compares to 546 installations in 2019. Now, part of the reason I think is also that there were more pilots. There were pilots in New York and Massachusetts, which helped the number. But it does require more policy help in order to see microgrids expand. And it requires more technology and business help. And along that lines, breaking news, as they say on CNN, is it was just announced Schneider Electric and 2 investor groups have formed a new company that's targeting 1 to 5 megawatt microgrid projects to primarily for businesses, business customers and institutions and hospitals where Schneider Electric has a strong base of customers, and to build out these microgrids with pre-engineered solutions and to sell the microgrid services as energy as a service to the customers. So customers do not have to worry about coming up with the capital investment and do not have to worry about the O&M costs. So it's very similar to businesses that are already operating under what used to be shared savings programs. Energy as a service is, as I said, it's an expansion from that, adding in not only the traditional energy management services and demand management services, but also adding in renewable energy connection and batteries and charging cars and those kinds of things. So they hope to have $1 billion at minimum in clean renewable energy assets under long-term contracts, which I think is a big deal. And other companies and other investors, if this is going well, will jump on the bandwagon, and that will also spur further development of 1 to 5 megawatt projects. And that leads us to our next speakers on nuclear and how that might fit. One of the key issues is that Sarah mentioned with solar and wind, renewable energy. What happens when solar and wind are not producing? And this has happened in Texas recently and in the UK. And one solution is possibly nuclear. Another solution is more batteries. Another solution is hydrogen, clean hydrogen, which is what France is working on. So I'm going to turn it on to our next speakers to talk about the nuclear solution to provide a reliable but flexible alternative.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim. And you've got it pegged right. I wanted to introduce our next 2 speakers. Wendy Simon Pearson is the General Counsel for UltraSafe Nuclear. And the company was founded about a decade ago, but really got going 3 or 4 years ago. Wendy serves on the board of directors of the U.S. Nuclear Industry Council. And she recently led the USNC's negotiations for their joint venture with Ontario Power Generation. And that will be a venture that will build the first demonstration reactor for USNC. And with her today, who's not an attorney, is Lorenzo Veneri, and he has been watching the development of the fuel and reactor systems for USNC from the very beginning, and he became one of the original employees. He's now a graduate student at the MIT Nuclear Science and Engineering Department under Professor Jacopo Buongiorno. And he is now working on colloids for heat transfer, and has worked before on solid state LIDAR and at the Los Alamos National Laboratory. So Wendy, take it away.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you, Jim, for your presentation. It was very interesting. And I didn't know about the Schneider Electric announcement, so I'm actually going to look that up right after this. But also thank you to the MIT Alumni Association for inviting us to present our company and our technology as a case study for the types of microgrids that we're talking about today. As Sarah said, my name is Wendy Simon Pearson. I'm the general counsel of USNC and its subsidiaries worldwide. However, as a company that's formerly a startup, now transitioning into a more long-term role, I often take on some of the functions outside of a traditional general counsel's role. Everybody sort of pitches in where they can. And the added value I think that I bring sometimes is that I'm not a nuclear engineer. I don't come from nuclear. I don't have a background in nuclear. I talked my way out of taking a physics class in high school because I was always more interested in arguing than in the science part of it. But luckily, I have got some really great people who have brought me up to date on the technology and the reasoning behind why USNC thinks that our fuel, FCM fuel, and our reactor, the MMR reactor, can really make such a change in the way that we structure our energy grid, both in the US and Canada. The history of USNC, oh, and also Lorenzo will be speaking right after me. If you have any technical questions, he's the person to talk to because I will not be able to answer them. USNC was founded out of Los Alamos National Laboratory by a group of scientists who had been working on an updated version of nuclear fuel in the 1990s and afterwards. Specifically, our CEO and president, Francesco Venere, had a very interesting experience when the Fukushima disaster happened almost 10 years ago now. He was living in Southern California at the time and had gone on a talk radio show in order to talk about what was going to happen after the safety system shut down. And he said that, he was going online publicly talking about how this is an American-built reactor. It's not going to have the same issues relating to Chernobyl. And his colleagues from South Korea called him up and said, you just have to stop saying this in public because the reactor is going to melt down. The way that the system and the way that traditional and large-scale gigawatt nuclear has been set up in the past is that there is a margin of error. There is a margin where the power of the nuclear fuel itself is so large that the safety systems don't always cover it. So that was the last straw for Francesco and our other founders. And that's when Ultra Safe Nuclear was born. They had developed a fuel within the national lab system in the United States that dealt with this issue. And they wanted to make sure that they could commercialize it. And so what is that fuel specifically? It's sort of a philosophy change from what traditional nuclear had done. In traditional nuclear, you have a bunch of uranium, which is packed very tightly, as much as you can, into a little fuel pellet. And then you take that fuel pellet, you want to extract as much energy from that as possible, but it's relatively, radioactive, all these other things. And so you need to build these safety systems surrounding it in order to make sure that the system functions. And so you build layers and layers of different types of safety systems in order to make sure that nothing bad happens. And 99% of the time, that works. We have between 98 and 100 reactors working in the United States, and there have not been, you always hear about a reactor having a problem because it doesn't happen super frequently. Most of the time, the safety systems work. But what we've done with FCM fuel is we take those safety protocols and we encompass it into the fuel layer. And our fully ceramic microencapsulated FCM fuel is the manifestation of that. So what have we done? So traditional fuel is more highly irradiated. We've decided that we don't want it to be that complicated. We want to reduce proliferation issues, for example, and make sure that the actual fuel we're using itself is just easier to access and all this other stuff. And so what we do is we use a low enriched version of uranium, which is called high assay LEU. And we take a little tiny piece of that and we cover it in about 5 different layers of protective coating to create a little ball called a triso particle, which is about 1 millimeter across, which is in the next slide, if you can. Thank you. So we've got that little fuel kernel. It's about 1 millimeter across. We then take these triso particles, and these are very protective layers in and of themselves, but we've taken it a step further after that. And we've distributed this into the silicon carbide matrix that gives the fuel its name. Now, silicon carbide is one of those interesting substances that is one of the hardest substances known to man. It is almost as hard as diamond. And there was an interesting analogy that was given to me about demonstrating in real time the properties of this particular substance, which is that if you go to a museum, a lot of the ancient artifacts that have been saved over the years are these clay pots, like Greek clay pots, and they're broken because they were broken when they were buried in the funeral pyres, but the actual material itself has not disintegrated, and that's because it's made of a similar material to silicon carbide. It doesn't disintegrate, it doesn't break, it's almost impossible to crack. And so we take that, the triso fuel, we distribute it into the silicon carbide matrix, and you have the protective coatings surrounding the fuel at the fuel level, which is innovative in and of itself. But the really fantastic thing that allows for is that because we've taken these elaborate safety systems and encompassed them into the fuel itself, we now get to play with the reactor system and deal with what traditionally has been an issue in terms of cost overruns and time overruns with building a nuclear reactor, and to address those on a massive scale. And so once we had the fuel, we developed the micromodular reactor, or the MMR, in order to go with that. The MMR itself is a 5 megawatt electric, 15 megawatt thermal reactor, which powers about 5,000 to 10,000 homes, or can be used in industrial processes for heat and other types of things that are unavailable to traditional nuclear reactors because of the scale of the heat that they are dealing with. And the cool part about this is that because it's no longer a great analogy to use, but I haven't come up with a new one. But the model of this reactor is based off of the traditional Boeing model of an airplane. You had airplanes which were hundreds of millions of dollars to build originally. But if you modularize them and you build them in a factory, you cut out the construction costs and other issues that traditionally have created cost and time overruns when building a reactor. And so this modularization is the business side advancement of pushing this to market. And so you take the fuel, which is about, one reactor takes about 2 tons of fuel, which is not very much in the grand scale of things. You have about 50 trucks that are shipped to the site. It's put together in about 6 months, and it doesn't need to be refueled for the life of the reactor, which is about 20 years. And the benefits to this, and the original market that we're looking at for this type of reactor is the remote mining communities and First Nations areas of Northern Canada. And in terms of the cost of the energy, we are looking at competing with almost exclusively diesel, fuel, and coal, which are shipped in on ice roads once a year. Those ice roads are freezing, they're less reliable than they used to be. Or they're flown in through airplanes, and the cost can be 60 cents or more per kilowatt hour to get energy up in those communities. We're looking at about 20 cents per kilowatt hour or less. That's a conservative estimate for our initial clients. And so, this is a great idea, but where's the manifestation of it? And so that's the really exciting thing, is that USNC right now is first to market in Canada. We partnered in June with Ontario Power Generation, which is the largest nuclear utility in Canada, in order to build our first demonstration reactor at the Chalk River site at CNL in Ontario. At this point in time, we're at the end of phase 2 of the vendor design review process for the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. And we are at the process where we've passed a couple of different stages with CNL and AECL, who own and operate the site that we're going to be building the reactor on. We have a parking lot that's been picked out as the site that we want to use. We're in the middle of the end side of an environmental impact assessment and active license to repair the site. So USNC is moving forward pretty rapidly with our processes, and we're very excited about demonstrating how this particular reactor and the small nature of it and the safety features that it encompasses, it allows it to be placed closer to human populations once it's been proven to be as safe as we've discussed today, and how those types of microgrids can function to provide a much cleaner source of power generally moving forward. So with that, I want to turn it over to Lorenzo Zeneri, and he can take away with a more specific case study of how this fits into a microgrid.
Okay, thanks, Wendy. So I'm going to briefly introduce the first application of the MMR for off-grid mines and communities, and how the MMR can, serve its function as a fully dispatchable heat source for these isolated microgrids. But keep in mind that it's not just for off-grid Canada, it's for off-grid anywhere, and beyond that, the plan is to integrate these in continental grids as dispatchable clean energy sources. So in Canada, we've got lots of undeveloped land ripe for a clean and environmentally friendly expansion. There's mines that need to grow, communities that have been confined because they're energy poor. They use roughly half the energy of that grid users, normal grid users use, because the prices are so high, and it's just not as available. So currently we're expecting pretty big growth in Northern Canada, specifically maybe 4 to 5 gigawatts of new capacity by 2030 at roughly 500 sites across Northern Canada. And they're too remote to be grid connected. You can't bring a pipeline in. It's hard to bring in diesel or natural gas, as Wendy was mentioning earlier. And of course, it's extremely harsh environment, and you have to have really reliable power. You can't afford to be without. So the options are limited. The power needs they have are varied. Communities tend to be diurnal and seasonal with slowly varying loads. And they're just using it for electricity, heating their homes, normal things. The mines, on the other hand, have 24-hour power needs throughout the year, and their loads are rapidly fluctuating as they bring equipment online, have work interruptions, or whatever. So this is a power demand curve example. To meet that kind of demand curve, you need really dispatchable power supplies. The solution so far has been diesel generators, and it's an aging fleet. They've been around since the beginning, so 50 or so years, and they need to be replaced bit by bit. They're roughly 1 to 5 megawatts. They usually have multiple units at the site for redundancy, and their prices are tied to oil prices, and so that you see huge fluctuations. In 2014, they were seeing prices in the 50 to 100 cent per kilowatt hour for electricity versus 10 cents that we pay in the Midwest or Southwest. So very high prices, and you're kind of a victim to national or international oil markets. And for mines, that means you can't really plan ahead. You're going to be you're going to have to take the oil prices, and your projects are going to be victims of changing times. And the result is you can't extract, you can't access mines that would otherwise be viable. So it's limiting resource extraction in a bad way. And on top of that, it's not clean. So we're bringing in a bunch of diesel out there, we're burning it, we're sometimes leaving the tanks up there, and you know, just the carbon emissions. So while not significant on a global scale, it's something that should be taken care of since we can. The other options they have available are solar and wind, but you have to couple those with diesel. So this chart just shows the basic metrics they have to meet, or the basic metrics to measure the different sources by. Diesel has 100% uptime. It's on demand, it's year round. The prices are pretty high. It can provide some privacy, but not well. And the district heating, you're just burning diesel or oil or using the electricity from the generators. It's not clean, it's not fixed cost. And the same goes with solar and wind, because you're gonna have to couple them with a diesel generator. There's simply not enough availability. The storage needs would be unwieldy to meet demand, especially in the winter. There's basically no sunlight, or certainly not enough. And the wind is not going to be reliable enough. They need power at all times, and you can't fail. Like it becomes dangerous when you fail. So the MMR manages to do all these things, and I'll explain briefly how. The first part, as Wendy mentioned, is the 20-year refueling. That means you can fix the cost at the beginning, and you don't have to worry about transporting it up. You don't have to worry about changing fuel prices in international markets. You can plan your projects with a fixed price, which is already a lower price than what you usually expect, but it's fixed. That means you know, you can start a project and expect it to be on budget, and you don't have to worry about closing the mine halfway through. It lowers the risk substantially for them. It's hard to appreciate, but there's no pipeline coming in. You don't have to worry about your supply. You've got 20 years worth of energy right there in your one reactor, or multiple if you have a larger site. And of course, it's resilient. You can black start it. It's standalone. You don't need an external grid. The other key feature that makes this really useful is the molten salt thermal storage. That's what gives it the 100% dispatch capability. And the way it works is the heat is generated in the reactor. We control it partly through the control rods, partly through the flow of helium. The helium carries that heat away to this molten salt heat exchanger, gives the heat to a molten salt, the same kind of molten salt that people use for concentrated solar plants. And the heat can then be used when it's needed. So you can think of it as a battery. It just stores heat until you want to actually use it. At that point, you generate steam, and you can run it through a turbine to generate your power. You can use it for process heat in an industrial facility, heaters, furnaces, whatever, or run it through people's homes through dedicated water heaters. And so this is kind of special in a nuclear power plant. Most nuclear power plants are baseload power only. They have to provide constant power, because when you shut down a reactor, you get xenon poisoning, and you can't start it back up very quickly. It takes days, maybe weeks. And this thing operates at constant power, heats this molten salt so you can get the power where you need it.
Lorenzo, we have not too much more than 5 minutes if we want to try and catch some of these questions. So
sounds good.
Please be aware of that.
Sure. Let me see what else I should. Yeah. So another point, another thing that makes this useful back in this plot right here, we can provide the process heat and district heating and much more. So this is much more than just power, electrical power. It's heat and all its varied uses. For communities, it means heating living spaces and shafts, providing freeze protection for piping and any infrastructure infrastructure that needs freeze protection. You can heat greenhouses, perhaps start growing food in these really remote locations year round. And then a key point is that when you have this cheap, secure electricity supply, you can fully electrify things. So you might want to use it even more than you initially intended. And you might start electrifying your ventilation systems, your haulers, your mobility vehicles. You kind of get these full electric mines, fully electric communities that use, they just stop using fossils essentially. And of course, process heat, as I discussed earlier, you can refine the materials on site and lower and increase the concentration of the material so you have less ore to ship out. Overall, these are just ways to improve the efficiency of these remote communities and lower their carbon emissions and costs and just make them more appealing for future growth. Briefly, the heat can be used for all sorts of industrial processes. So one of our aims is to increase the temperature from 630 degrees C, which is already quite a bit higher than normal nuclear reactors, which is 450 to 500 maybe, so that this heat can be used for all sorts of industrial processes and become kind of a bedrock for industrial facilities, which are currently emitting something like 25% of carbon emissions. So again, it's more than just electrical power. It's all our heat uses to power communities and industrial sites, bases, and campuses. Sarah asked me to briefly mention what's going on with our spent fuel. And so the reactor produces maybe 1 to 2 tons of radioactive spent fuel over the 20-year lifetime. And yes, it's not safe to stand next to, certainly not as soon as you take it out, and likely not for maybe decades. After that, you don't want this stuff to leak into your water supply for over 100,000 years, at least. Of course, you can take this fuel and use it again in a deep burn reactor, which don't exist yet, so we're not advertising that as part of the solution. But that would lower the waste, the danger of the waste, lower the toxicity to maybe tens of thousands of years rather than hundreds of thousands of years. But crucially, the fuel outlasts the radioactivity of the spent fuel. In its solid, compact form, deep in the bedrock that hasn't moved in millions of years, it's not really going anywhere. It's just sitting there. Whereas fossils, for an equivalent power produced, have created 1 million tons of carbon dioxide and other pollutants indefinitely dispersed into the atmosphere. So no one likes that. And solar and wind, great, but we're going to be using more land, and the material waste will be significantly higher. Of course, the toxicity is different, but the sheer mass of material is nothing to ignore. With that, Wendy, would you like to finish it up, please?
Yeah, I like to end with this quote. Thank you, Lorenzo. I like to end with this quote, which was in the open letter from leading climate scientists a couple of years back, saying that there's no credible path to climate stabilization that does not include a substantial role for nuclear power. USNC tries to acknowledge that there's been a lot of issues with nuclear communicating with the public. What is the technology? How do we create safety systems where you do feel safe having it in your backyard? But one of the things that led me to this company is before I took the job, I went to my 2 friends who worked at Greenpeace, and I asked them to talk me out of it, to say, what are all the reasons why I shouldn't go work for a nuclear company? And both of them said that despite Greenpeace being anti-nuclear historically, both of them thought that nuclear had to be a part of the solution. And so on a personal level, I'm really excited to see a technology come in that's clean, that can provide a complement to renewables. And I think that that's the really important thing that I try to communicate, is that this type of nuclear is a complement to renewables. It's not a replacement for it. It provides the service that renewables can't provide for themselves, and that you would need battery power from technology that's developed in the next 10 years to do that. Nuclear exists today. USNC's technology exists right now, and we're just in the process of commercializing it. So thank you.
Thank you. Yes, we have had a few questions. The one question that has come in from a couple of places is how well these technologies can how well they can apply to international areas, developing areas, Africa, Puerto Rico. If Wendy and Jim would like to quickly try to address what it's going to mean in other parts of the world, and perhaps whether it will allow other parts of the world also to have job development.
Absolutely. So USNC's 5-megawatt reactor isn't going to create your entire nuclear energy program, but traditional nuclear needs thousands and thousands of highly trained workers to run one of the reactors, whereas USNC's reactor is set up to be a flip switch on, flip switch off reactor. And because of the passive safety systems that we talked about with the fuel, it's a lot simpler and a lot safer to train local people on the ground to do that, which means that, you know, for example, last October, I was at a conference in Kenya because the energy department there was looking at nuclear and micronuclear as a way to go and provide energy to hospitals where the diesel generator broke and they couldn't get a new one there in a really long time period. And so we see that there's actually an enormous amount of applicability in places like remote places in Kenya, remote regions in Canada, or in places like, for example, Puerto Rico, somebody said in the comments. We're actively looking at the Puerto Rican market because a nuclear reactor that's built to withstand all sorts of different calamitous events is the best situated to deal with extreme weather as hurricanes get worse in that region of the world. Jim, you're on mute.
Oh, so was I. Jim, there you go.
Can you hear me okay? I changed my microphone, so maybe I could be heard better. Microgrid technology is not that sophisticated from the standpoint of a science project. It's well developed. It's basically putting together solar, wind, and batteries, which are readily available and are being implemented throughout the world, with a sophisticated control system interconnected to the existing grid. So it can be used anywhere and everywhere. The key issue, as I said, is interconnecting it to the grid. And the controls mechanism that the grid operator has and the microgrid has, that's the issue. And many countries have state-owned utilities, and I honestly don't know their interest to have a microgrid connected to their grid. It may be more of a political issue than it is technical or financial issue.
And I'm mute again. There we go. So another question is, let me just follow up a moment on that, is would either of these, and how would either of these work in places like Puerto Rico, places that have been devastated by impact of climate extremes and are now rebuilding grids and trying to set up grids? Can we look at these technologies for rebuilding our electric supply systems?
Well, Puerto Rico has relied traditionally on central power stations operated with oil-based generators and bringing the oil in and importing it. But breaking the system down into smaller grids makes a lot of sense, because then entire parts of the country don't have to be shut down when one part goes down. Now, I honestly don't know what's going on in terms of the rebuilding of Puerto Rico, if they're factoring in a rebuild of the transmission system or not.
All right. There is a question about microgrid jobs and also these reactor jobs. There's an MIT alumni who provides technical assistance to small business owners. So we have talked a little bit about how being able to use heat and to have different kinds of loads in a microgrid in a small generation system really helps a lot. But would either of you or both of you please give a few words on how this affects power contracts and jobs for people developing businesses anywhere or communities anywhere?
Well, my first comment is that, and I don't know the person's background, but if the person is an electrical engineer, there is a high demand for power electrical engineers. There just are not enough of them. And the utilities are looking for people with that background, companies like Amoresco, Engie, and Enel, you name it, are looking for electrical engineers. With respect to microgrids, I would be looking at the companies that are developing the control systems. And again, those are control engineers, power engineers, and computer engineers that would be going after those types of jobs. But I think it's a very rich area for job growth, especially if we have a different administration in Washington after next year. We know that a possible President Biden is going to support clean energy significantly, and that will spur lots of jobs. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but
all right. Wendy,
there is a deficit of people.
Comments in terms of jobs?
Yeah, jobs and how it works in a community. Yep.
Yeah, so the added value of an MMR in a community is often the sort of access to energy that wasn't there before. And one of the benefits of an MMR system is that you don't have the traditional jobs of a regular nuclear reactor that's a gigawatt. However, a traditional nuclear reactor is built on site. We need thousands and thousands of skilled laborers and workers to man our factories, to help figure out, how to build these things efficiently and do the licensing associated with it. It's a fairly complicated process, even though we've simplified it as much as we can. And so, for example, we're looking at certain areas near our headquarters in Seattle, where there's a traditional nuclear workforce to hire for the factories that we're putting together. So that's where the jobs really come in for ours. I know less about the microgrid aspect of it, but I can imagine through the utilities that there'll have to be certain also strategic plans put together for how to, again, weave in the usefulness of USNC, like a USNC microgrid MMR as a sort of baseload power, although not in the traditional sense, along with renewable. So I imagine that there will have to be a lot of consulting jobs for utilities who are looking to meet local clean carbon standards, but have to think outside of the box and create a system that really hasn't existed before.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We're just about down to our time. We have a lot of questions here about nuclear systems, which I encourage everyone to write to Alumni Energy, and we will try and respond to questions specifically. I'm delighted to have everybody here. Thank you so much, Wendy, Lorenzo, and Jim, for joining us for this discussion today. We at Energy, Environment, and Sustainability Network will ask you to please, anyone interested should please go up to our website. You can find it, I just Googled it by saying MIT EESN, and there we have webinars and slides and recordings on our resources page. So please feel free to join us there. We are in the next while working very hard with various ambassadors from around the world to try and collect more of the climate, energy, and environment information and webinars that people are doing around the world, alumni clubs and alumni themselves. And so that'll be up on our website as well. And we do also in EESN have an action group that really wants to spread the word that the climate crisis is serious, and our transition to other forms of energy, modern energy and clean energy, is very important. So we as alums, they would tell us that we as alums need to be sure our decision makers understand the seriousness of the climate. So please stay in touch. There'll be another webinar next month. I want to thank Wendy, Lorenzo, and Jim again for joining us today, and all the rest of you participants. And we will try and get questions answered from the Q&A that we were unable to get to today. So thank you all. Have a great day, whether it's 1 o'clock in the morning in Singapore or still pretty early on the west coast of the United States. We'll see you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us. And for more information on how to connect with the MIT Alumni Association, please visit our website.